Our next speaker this morning is Cristen Krebs. Cristen is the founder and executive director of Catholic Hospice and Palliative Services near Pittsburgh and Wexford. She's a graduate of Robert Morris University's Doctor of Nursing Practice program with 20 years of end-of-life care experience. In 1997, Dr. Krebs began the first faith-based nonprofit hospice program serving Pittsburgh and surrounding counties. In May 2007, she incorporated Catholic Hospice, the only pro-life nonprofit hospice in Pittsburgh. Cristen will be speaking on hospice in the 21st century, a life-affirming model. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Cristen. I'm actually working with her to help expand Catholic Hospice's services into the Greensburg Diocese and hopefully into the Diocese of Altoona and Johnstown at some point in the future. So welcome, Cristen.
Thanks so much to the Human Life Alliance and Pro-Life Healthcare Alliance for allowing me this opportunity to share with you, and to St. Francis University for allowing us to be in this beautiful location today. So as Brian said, I've spent the last 23 years caring for individuals who are terminally ill, and prior to that, I worked in oncology. So when I'm delivering this information, which is not probably what you know about, I think Julie made the comment that when you get in a hospital situation, you often don't even have an idea of what's really hidden there. And that's very true about hospice today as well. So when I share this with you, what I want you to really remember is this really isn't about me, it's not about Catholic Hospice, but it's about those patients that we care for who are invisibly standing alongside us here, who really deserve a particular kind of end-of-life care. And they're definitely in society across the nation today getting less than that. So just as the battle to protect the unborn wages between pro-life pregnancy centers and Planned Parenthood, there is another battle being waged in the shadows that requires the same attention, education, and awareness. And this is the battle occurring at the other end of life's spectrum with care of the terminally ill, a battle you may not even know has been waged. So in the years since Roe v. Wade, would you dare say that all pregnancy centers are equal? Of course, that would be ridiculous. We would never say that. We know that some are pro-life and some offer choice, support abortion. But most of us in this room today would all agree that pro-life pregnancy resource centers have been called the kind, calm, non-judgmental face of the pro-life movement, offering free pregnancy tests, ultrasounds, anti-abortion information, parenting classes, and material assistance are just some of the many services offered that empower women to choose life. These ministry centers offer hope to women facing unplanned pregnancies by providing practical help and emotional support. They provide life-saving help in a truly life-changing way by assisting women who are at risk for abortion with the life-affirming practical support they need to choose life, and then prepare them to parent or place a baby up for adoption. These pro-life pregnancy resource centers are nonprofit organizations. I wouldn't know of one that's pro-life that would be a for-profit resource center. The overwhelming majority of them in the United States are run by pro-life Christians according to a conservative Christian philosophy. And even more specifically, many are run by the Catholic Church or other church groups. In fact, the largest pro-life pregnancy centers network in the United States is explicitly evangelistic in nature and says that its ultimate aim is to share the love and truth of Jesus Christ in both word and deed, and that its pregnancy centers are committed to sharing the love of Christ with every person who walks through the doors. The literature handed out by these pro-life pregnancy centers is explicitly consistent with biblical principles, as they strongly believe that sharing the gospel is an essential part of counseling women in need of pregnancy help. There are over 2,300 pro-life pregnancy resource centers in the United States, where only 3% of the world's 46 million yearly induced abortions occur. So we have 23 pro-life pregnancy centers, definitively pro-life centers, for 1.3 million abortions out of 46 million. So clearly, in the United States, we have created quite a magnificent pro-life network at the beginning of life, an infrastructure that definitively embraces life and teaches the gospel. So if I ask you today, where the closest pro-life pregnancy center is, you would know. And if you didn't, you'd pick up your iPhone and Google, and within seconds, you would know exactly where to send somebody if they ask. And when you got on perhaps that website, you would find that the godly principles aren't hidden. God and life are the consistent themes of these pro-life pregnancy resource centers. So indeed, not all pregnancy centers are equal. But if I ask you where the closest pro-life at end-of-life resource center is, what would you say? Where would you send someone? Do you mistakenly assume that all hospices are equal or that they're pro-life? We make the mistake of assuming that hospices, and we'll get to this in a second, are like they were in the 70s and 80s. We want to believe they're all pro-life. But we make this mistake, and we end up sending our loved ones often into care at end of life, into networks that are not supporting life at all. The terminally ill are easy prey. Just like the unborn, they are voiceless and vulnerable. They are the sickest of the sick. They are weak, tired, defeated, and that makes them easy prey. It's imperative we shine light on this darkness just as we did with the abortion movement if we're going to protect the dying and reclaim the pro-life foundation. Yes, the pro-life foundation, historically pro-life early hospice movement. So a little bit of the history of the hospice movement. So as I said, it was definitively a pro-life movement in its early phase. So of course we all know the parable of the Good Samaritan, probably our best first example of comfort care for someone in need. In 1095, we saw the rise of the crusading movement, where thousands and thousands of people were traveling across Europe to reclaim the Holy Land. These journeys lasted for long, long periods of time, and people became sick, and many of them often died. And so designated centers were created to provide comfort for these folks. Same thing in Rhodes in the 1300s, and it wasn't until the 1600s that religious orders began to organize care of the dying. Again, definitively pro-life care. The Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul in France was the first religious order to care for the dying. Then, of course, we all know Mother Teresa in the 1950s. She started her Missionaries of Charity in Calcutta, where she was caring for the poor and the sick and the dying, and then moved her ministry into the United States on the West Coast and in New York to care for those who were dying of AIDS. But it's this woman, Cicely Saunders, who is credited with being the founder of the modern day hospice movement. Cicely Saunders was a nurse and then went on to study to be a social worker and an overachiever. She went on to be a physician. And Cicely Saunders, no matter what discipline she had been practicing in, took great interest in how people were dying in the hospitals that she had provided care in. And she noticed that these folks were often isolated. They did not have good pain or symptom management. They didn't have spiritual care. Their families weren't able to visit. And so she began to develop a model of care that would change, ultimately forever, care of the dying. Her model was definitively pro-life, founded on Christian principles. She said hospice becomes an option when illness no longer responds to curative modalities. Hospice care is that something more that can be done when an illness cannot be cured. The goal is to help people live symptom-free while affirming peace, dignity, and sanctity of life. Important words. She doesn't say quality. She says sanctity and dignity. Hospice care provides an opportunity for the patient and their loved ones to focus on life. And she was instrumental in founding in 1967 St. Christopher's Hospice in London, which is still standing and sees thousands of patients a year. In 1965, she was invited to become a visiting faculty member at Yale. At that time, Florence Wald, who was the dean of Yale's nursing school, began to study with Cicely Saunders, and that led them together to form the first hospice in the United States, the Connecticut Hospice. And that hospice as well is still standing. The Key thing about 1974's hospice in the United States is there's no revenue source. So the Connecticut hospice is run by volunteers and churches, run on church donations and grants, because there is no way to bill for hospice care in 1974. Shortly after this first hospice is founded, Pope John Paul II authors his stance on dignified care to the dying in what's known as the Declaration on Euthanasia. It clarifies the Church's position and provides moral direction on euthanasia, makes clear the right to life, not just for Catholics, but for all Christian faiths. It advocates that those experiencing terminal illness receive the care due to them according to Scripture and are not preyed upon. These are exact words from the Declaration on Euthanasia. He asks that the terminally ill not be preyed upon, neglected, or offended at this sacred time of life. And he says the terminally ill deserve solidarity, communion, and affection. So it's not till 1986 that Medicare adopts the hospice benefit. It was introduced in 1982. It was denied, 1983, denied again. It wasn't until 1986 that Medicare actually develops this hospice benefit. So this benefit provides guidelines for how we as practitioners are to care for the terminally ill. But the biggest key is it provides a payment system. So again, prior to 86, every hospice that had formed had no way of billing for its care. So it was all hospices prior to 86 were run as charitable organizations. But in 1986, we now have this payment system. And just like everything else in healthcare you can imagine, what begins to happen after 1986? So Medicare states that these guidelines, under these guidelines, a patient must have a terminal diagnosis and a prognosis of 6 months or less if the disease runs its normal course. Medicare provides specific clinical criteria for each diagnosis. So we don't just go in and determine whether someone indeed meets hospice criteria. Medicare set that into place for us. For cancer patients, for end-stage cardiac patients, if you have lung disease, kidney disease, the guidelines are written so we know what we are looking for, so we don't put someone on hospice too soon. That was the purpose in 1986. Hospice must obtain medical records, meaning tests, MRIs, labs, information proving that indeed someone is terminal. The patient's attending physician and a hospice medical director together must certify that the life expectancy is indeed limited. 2 physicians working together, and that's for protection of the patient, so that again, someone doesn't end up on hospice who indeed is not terminally ill. And then hospice must provide all disciplines, visits, all medical equipment, all the supplies, and all the medications that that patient needs. That is the law. So if they're going to bill for reimbursement to Medicare, the hospice then takes on all the financial responsibility for those things. The Medicare hospice benefit says this is the interdisciplinary team. So all of these folks in this circle must be offered to the patient and their family. So we have registered nurse, the hospice aide, volunteers, chaplains, social work, bereavement care. And none of those are optional. They all must be offered, and then it's up to the patient or the family as to whether they want to accept certain disciplines. This is what the per diem reimbursement looks like. So there's 4 levels of hospice care. Routine hospice care is the most common, so the hospice bills. And most private insurances mimic this. UPMC, Highmark, those kind of policies mimic this benefit. So the routine hospice care is the most popular. 90-some% of patients are only getting the routine level of care, which is the most minimal reimbursement. But with that $150 a day, the hospice must provide all the services, all the disciplines visiting, the medications, medical equipment, supplies if someone should need a dressing change or things like that. The thing about per diem reimbursement is that that begins on the day the patient's admitted to hospice. So if the patient lives 60 days, the hospice is billing 60 days times 150. And every year that 150 goes up a little wee bit, a few cents here and there. The last 2 benefits reimbursement rates on the list, the continuous care and the inpatient, are meant for crisis care. It says right in Medicare law that these 2 benefits, because they can be billed at such a high rate, are not to be used very often. And indeed, we don't use them very often. So you can see 1974, there's that itty-bitty Connecticut hospice, and by the time 1985 hits, you could see this surge of growth after the Medicare hospice benefit gets elected in. By 2011, 5,300 hospices across the nation, the majority of them now for-profit, governed by shareholders because they want a piece of that Medicare hospice reimbursement. Again, you can see the number of hospice patients surge. So in 1985, we were caring for about 160,000 people in the United States. The Medicare benefit comes, all of these hospices open, and the number of patients served by hospices hits the million mark in 2004. So in 2011, we have 1.75 million Americans receiving care from these 5,300 hospices. You can see the change from 1989, just this incredible surge. And the demographics begin to change. So still we're taking care of, in the red is 1989, and on the other side is 2011. So still we're caring for mostly this Medicare-aged, although private insurances continue to write better and better hospice benefits, so we are caring for younger people. Most of them are Caucasian. We still have this race issue. 41% now die in their own home. Most people are surprised by that statistic. In 1989, 86% were dying in their own homes. Now, the majority of hospice patients aren't in their own homes. Across the nation, they're in nursing facilities. And only 40 to 50% of them have cancer. Some of that is simply attributed to the fact that cancer care has improved and there are a lot more treatments available for folks. But also, well, we'll see in a minute that other populations have been targeted for their Medicare benefit. So in 2012, in the United States, there was a total of 2.4 million deaths from all kinds of different reasons in the United States. And statistics show us that 1.7 million of that 2.4 had hospice. But what's frightening about that is that in polls of patients, in living patients and their families, approximately only a third of terminally ill patients received in-depth hospice care. So what does that mean? That means that a third of these patients never saw all those disciplines we talked about, didn't have their medications covered, didn't have their DME supplied, durable medical equipment, didn't have supplies brought to the bedside. So a third of that 1.7 didn't even have all the things they were supposed to have. 4 out of 10 families indicated hospice care was provided too late. A third of hospice patients, it turns out, now that we've done lots more research, were not appropriate for hospice at the time they were admitted anyway. And in 2012, we had more than 200,000 discharged alive. Over the past decade, the Medicare spending on hospice has increased at the staggering rate of 17% per year. So in 2000, Medicare was billed $2.9 billion for 700,000 patients. In 2010, Medicare's billed $13 billion for 1.2 million. So some experts applaud this wider use of hospice services across the nation. They think it's great that there's this greater acceptance of hospice care. I'm definitely not one of them. So see, these Medicare payments to hospice providers are growing disproportionately, as you can see from these statistics. So we have the number of beneficiaries using the hospice benefit has doubled, but the payments have quadrupled. Of course, that doesn't make sense. What makes sense is that hospices across the nation that are for-profit, governed by shareholders, are using these two higher rates that are supposed to be saved for crisis care to put a lot of patients on fraudulently so they can bill at the higher rate. So clearly, we have challenges to the present-day delivery of hospice services. So some of these challenges: knowledge and attitudes of patients and healthcare providers. Well, still death and dying is the proverbial elephant in the living room. None of us want to talk about it. We end up talking about it when we are indeed right up against it. And so we are always ill-prepared. The average patient and their physician or practitioner knows that hospice means dying, but they don't want to think or talk about death and dying. They think there is this one thing called hospice, and all of them are pro-life and nonprofit. They are not caught up to speed from the early 80s to the present day. They don't know their federal end-of-life rights or entitlements, but you do have them. Everybody does under the law. They don't know how to interview a hospice or what questions to ask. And this kind of ignorance has led the terminally ill to be vulnerable prey. Most people don't know that hospice agencies are the fastest growing healthcare entity in the United States. We were second to the little urgy clinics that are opening, and now we have soared beyond that again. So we're the fastest growing healthcare entity in the United States in numbers of centers and in healthcare fraud. So the second challenge is this for-profit mentality invading our hospice movement. Hospice care has evolved from charitable roots to a $13 billion a year business, run mostly as for-profit, with a majority of hospices across the nation trading on the stock market. The range of mandatory services offered by for-profit-minded hospices is narrower than the not-for-profits that have true mission. And I say for-profit-minded because we have big medical systems that are not-for-profit organizations that have hospice agencies that are run very much like businesses, although they do carry a not-for-profit status. These for-profit-minded agencies pay higher salaries and benefits to a less skilled staff. And why does that matter to you? It matters because the kind of medication we use does not belong in the hands of less skilled staff. They employ fewer nurses, focus on increased productivity, which translates into less visits for patients and family members. And they aggressively are seeking out patients with nursing home patients and patients with dementia. So in 1982, the OIG found that 82% of hospice claims for patients living in nursing facilities never met Medicare coverage requirement. It means they were admitted fraudulently because they lived in nursing homes and were easily preyed upon. So this statistic just comes out, 82%. And you can see by this chart that in 1998, we didn't care for many patients with dementia or general debility. So general debility is often folks who are living into their 90s, who have many, many different healthcare issues and are just in a general period of decline. We did not admit very many of those, and then you see in 2009 that number surges. So they're going around into nursing homes signing up lots of people who are elderly or have dementia, but those folks never truly met the end stage requirements by Medicare. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Brian. So up until a decade ago, hospice was primarily used by patients diagnosed with cancer whose stay in the program was relatively short, given the terminal nature of their cancer diagnosis. But today, that's not the case. And a study published last year in the New England Journal of Medicine found that in 1990, 16% of Medicare hospice patients had non-cancer diagnoses. That was 1990. But by the end of 2012, more than 2/3 of our hospice patients are non-cancer patients, the majority of them with cardiovascular disease or dementia. Whoops. The third challenge is hospice marketing. I can tell you when I got my start in hospice, I was very privileged to be part of a group that was started by 3 churches in the south of Pittsburgh. We were charitable, nonprofit, and were one of the very first to get Medicare certified in Pennsylvania. There was no such thing as hospice marketing. We did a lot of great education. But when this for-profit-minded hospices and their business models came on the scene, we saw these aggressive marketing tactics unfold. So these are actually taken from some case law of hospices that were indicted for fraud. But these were the inappropriate sales tactics they had going on for their marketers. Summer sizzle, Christmas cash blitz, fall frenzy. So for every hospice patient they would sign on the program, these marketers would get a bonus. So the increased marketing and the idea of even having a hospice marketer results in a reduction in bedside hospice care. Most often, these companies are paying these marketers a lot of money to go out and find patients, but they don't have a lot of nurses or nursing aides to care for the patients. Limited coverage of medications and supplies. It's leading to patients getting billed for these things that hospice was supposed to be providing. The patients and families are often pressured, very much pressured by these salespeople to sign on to hospice programs. They feel like they can't say no. And then there's bonuses for marketers, profit for shareholders, and for the owners of these hospices. My belief is hospice marketing makes a mockery out of patient suffering that we see every single day, and it in no way enhances bedside care. There is no way anybody will convince me as a practitioner that a salesperson can anyway enhance the care at the bedside for someone as sick as the patients we see. So the next challenge is this issue of fraud. These are just some of the examples of, if you Google hospice Medicare fraud, you will be floored at how many pages come up and how many agencies have now been caught in the United States committing this fraud. In Pennsylvania, this was our latest, Horizons Hospice. The medical director is actually in prison because he was writing false scripts. He's doing 11 years for that. At the same time, he was also a medical director of this hospice. clean to report that Horizons Hospice was falsely certifying patients as appropriate for hospice, but they really weren't. Keeping patients on hospice 2 to 6 years so they could bill their insurance. And falsifying hospital medical records. There are now 2 additional cases pending, and there'll be more to follow, where patients actually died who weren't appropriate because they were stripped of their routine medications. So there are cases of patients who were in their 40s and 50s who had cardiac disease, not severe enough to be on hospice, but this particular medical director had taken them off their medication so they could look more hospice appropriate, and those patients subsequently died. VITAS in 2013 is another big one here in the state of Pennsylvania, but they're all over the nation. I think they have 22 or 25 hospice. They're in 22 states or something. They're actually owned by Roto-Rooter Plumbing Services. So these are just big business chains who get the idea that having hospice as part of their business umbrella makes them a lot of money. They've now been accused pretty much of the same thing, falsely reporting higher level of care so they could bill more, keeping patients on 4 and 5 years, use of significant pain medications, and that's very concerning. They're giving patients these very, very dangerous medications so they appear to look more hospice appropriate and they can get away with this false billing. The government estimate is that they've probably falsely billed about $1 billion per year, just VITAS alone. The next challenge, of course, is health care reform. While we don't know exactly how this will unfold in end-of-life care, we're starting to see the beginnings of it. We know there'll be decrease in specific treatments available to late-stage chronically ill and the terminally ill, an increase in the number of patients served as outpatients. Duke did a study in 2009 to show that if we put a patient on hospice, we're probably reducing Medicare costs by an average of $2,300 per patient. So the government has 3.6 billion reasons to push hospice care on people, even if it's not appropriate. They only view it as a money saver. And that's how it's being marketed, as a cost cutter. And then, of course, this challenge of euthanasia. So as Julie talked about, euthanasia is an intentional action or omission that directly or indirectly causes the death of a person to end pain and suffering. Physician-assisted suicide is legal in 3 states. This idea of stealth euthanasia is hastening death due to negligence while pretending to provide appropriate care, mainly to terminally ill, seniors, and the disabled. It can be intentional or non-intentional. Pope Francis has warned against this more subtle form of disregard for human dignity and what he calls covert euthanasia. He says, in this consumerist and narcissistic society, we are accustomed to the idea that there are people amongst us who are disposable: the terminally ill, the elderly, and the disabled. Citing examples of intentional neglect, the Pope says, I believe that today there is covert euthanasia. Our Social Security pays up until a certain amount of treatment and then says, may God help you. The Pope goes on to say that hospice is a great hiding place for this activity because the general public believes that all hospices are good and that all are an alternative to euthanasia. Most Americans do not know that proponents of the euthanasia movement have entered the end-of-life care arena via hospice agencies to achieve their own purposes. So how would an organization commit stealth euthanasia? They would discontinue food and fluids when a loved one is not dying or near death enough. They often accompany this by morphine to deaden the pain of starvation and dehydration. They deny medication and ordinary treatments for things like routine infections when someone is not near death. Or they terminate medications, like some of these hospices that have been caught for fraud were caught doing. They withhold routine medication for chronic conditions. So, for example, you may have cancer, but you also may have a cardiac condition. If you withhold those medications too soon, then you might hasten someone's death. They use terminal sedation, which refers to rendering a dying person unresponsive. They falsely certify patients as hospice eligible and then do things to make them look more appropriate. In Pennsylvania, we do have a Senate bill pending right now to legalize physician-assisted suicide. It will expire in December of this year, but Senator Leach has already said he will be reintroducing this because he had a brother-in-law who died of lymphoma I think he was 32 or 38 or something like that, and he believes that his brother-in-law should have had the ability to take a lethal dose of morphine and kill himself. So he is very much pushing this in Pennsylvania. Under this Death with Dignity Act in Pennsylvania, the patient would have to be a resident of Pennsylvania, the request has to come from the patient. His bill says the Death with Dignity Act is voluntary, informed and made without coercion of any kind. But this is the part where I get concerned. The patient's attending physician would have to certify that the patient has a terminal disease, has less than 6 months to live, has no hope of recovery, and has been told of all options, including the possibility of treatment versus pain and symptom control. And then a second consulting physician would have to agree. So what does that look like? All of those conditions are conditions for hospice care. So you see how they start slowly molding their euthanasia agenda into our existing hospice law. And of course, we know the Hemlock Society is alive and well after our Brittany Maynard case. They go by lots of different names now. Most often it's Compassion and Choices, although we've heard end-of-life choices and death with dignity as of late. They counsel the hopelessly ill people on ending their lives, and they are coming up alongside hospice agencies to push their agenda. So stealth euthanasia, who is at risk? Well, we know it's the terminally ill, the elderly, disabled, and those suffering from severe mental illness. And if you think it can't happen under the umbrella of a hospice agency, this is all we need to remember, is that Terry Schiavo was admitted to a hospice facility and put on the hospice benefit, where we would have thought she would have been protected. Under Cicely Saunders' model, she would have been protected. But under the modern hospice model, indeed, she wasn't, and that hospice withdrew food and fluid and gave her lethal doses of medication. So we have this slippery slope. In 1986, we have these federal guidelines in revenue, and hospice is still pretty okay. By 1993, we see it's all about the revenue as we see the surge of hospices grow across the United States. And now we know, based on the fraud cases and the things that are happening in our media, that there is neglect and harm to patients and families under hospice programs. So in the 21st century, we have the Medicare hospice benefit. It's no longer Cicely Saunders Hospice, founded in '67. It's no longer the federal model of 1986. We have now reconstructed death from a natural, beautiful process to a clinical procedure with great monetary value. These challenges that we talked about redefine the practical and moral arguments to oppose euthanasia. We're no longer looking to the church for guidance in how we care for our dying. We're no longer open about discussing issues regarding death and dying. We don't condemn the neglect of terminally ill in our society. In fact, we've started to make it glamorous. We no longer call for high-quality pain and symptom management, and we no longer talk about the sanctity and dignity in care of the dying. In 2007, myself and several colleagues started Catholic Hospice. It's a pro-life, definitively pro-life model dedicated to glorifying God by providing compassionate care to individuals facing life-limiting illnesses. We serve all faiths. And as I said, we are clearly pro-life, standing on the teachings of the church. Our model believes that all life is valuable and no death should be hastened. We look solely to the Vatican's Declaration on Euthanasia for guidance in how we care for our patients every day. We affirm dignity and sanctity of human life. All of us at Catholic Hospice believe that hospice is not big business and no party should be profiting from the unfortunate suffering of those diagnosed with a terminal illness. We respect that the patients and families must be well informed and never pressured to sign on to hospice. They need to take their time and clearly be educated and feel confident in the decision they've made to stop treatment and pursue comfort care. We adhere to the principle of benefit and burden. So the benefit of a treatment must be equal or greater than the burden experienced. The perfect example here is IV hydration or IV fluids. For some folks, depending on their condition, we would not be forcing fluids on them because perhaps they already have a lot of swelling in their limbs or lots of fluid in their lungs. But for other patients, we do offer it as it provides tremendous comfort, especially for our ovarian cancer patients, patients with a GI cancer, patients with bone metastases. Those patients benefit tremendously, and a lot of our elderly need a little bit of fluid so that they don't die from dehydration. We adhere to ordinary means versus extraordinary means, and we know that the church teaches a person is bound to use ordinary means of caring, and that's just general nourishment, food and water, and basic care, turning someone every couple of hours, cleaning them, those kind of things. So a person is bound to use ordinary means, following the church's teachings, but may use and is not bound to something extraordinary, and that could be something like a ventilator, things like that. Present-day advancements in modern health make this very, very difficult for a lot of patients and families because they have so much that has been offered to them often. Nutrition and hydration. All of our patients at Catholic Hospice are provided food and water, as nutrition and hydration are morally obligatory. All patients would be eligible for feeding tubes and IV hydration depending on their particular disease process. Nutrition and hydration may be discontinued only when they cannot achieve their natural purposes, such as when the body can no longer process them. And people who are dying from a terminal illness, their bodies are very smart. They know exactly when they can't take any more, but we always offer. And if someone has a feeding tube, we taper it. We never just stop it. Same thing with IV hydration. There is no reason we can't begin a taper and watch what the body does. So abrupt withdrawal of nutrition and hydration is not a hospice concept, although you hear hospices today say, well, we can't take you because you have a feeding tube or because you have hydration. That isn't a hospice concept. That's a business model concept. Additional therapies, we do have patients who want to receive oral or IV antibiotics, and a lot of times those antibiotics provide tremendous comfort. If someone's dying of cancer and develops a little bit of pneumonia or a urinary tract infection, we treat it. It is not comfortable to walk around with those things, and again, you'll hear hospices say we don't provide those things. It's because the hospice has to pay for those antibiotics. Other times we have patients who want to have a transfusion, might have a little additional radiation therapy. We do support this at Catholic Hospice for comfort care. Refusal to implement additional therapies is not a hospice concept. In fact, the federal law under hospice requires that we allow patients to pursue these things if it would indeed provide them comfort. DNR status is not mandatory. We have hospices, and this came out in some of these recent fraud cases where they were making every patient sign a DNR. We have some hospices pushing the post. It is not mandatory that anybody sign those things. Federal law states you can come onto hospice. You don't have to be a do not resuscitate at the time you're admitted to hospice or any time during your stay with a hospice organization. Pain control, we do use all of the traditional pain medications that are out there, but we do it very carefully and titrate very, very slowly and carefully. A lot of our elderly patients have never had any pain medication, and you don't have to have pain medication and anti-anxiety medication to be on a hospice program. You know, we don't cookie cutter our care. These are very, very strong medications that could do a lot of harm if we don't utilize them correctly. This concept of terminal sedation in a pro-life hospice, it's never, ever a hospice concept. Permanently sedating the patient or allowing the patient to dehydrate and die is not acceptable hospice care. It looks outwardly peaceful as the patient is made to sleep in a medically induced coma. So this terminal sedation can be done in hospice and doesn't outwardly appear as overt euthanasia or assisted suicide. So again, there's that stealth euthanasia piece. It's very hidden. Those in favor of euthanasia use the words mercy and compassion as they argue to legalize terminal sedation under hospice. The church opposes permanently sedating a patient for the sole purpose of rendering the patient unresponsive. The other piece that we have just started at Catholic Hospice is a program called The Promise. It's a perinatal palliative care program. This is a program that's committed to walking alongside families who have a poor prognosis for their unborn baby and were told to abort. So we come up alongside these women and journey with them. Sometimes the baby is born and lives for a few days, and then we care for the baby at home on hospice. And other times, the baby might live just minutes after delivery. But we allow these women to make it through their entire pregnancy with support. We have perinatal doulas who work with us, who are specialized in infant loss, who walk with these women. At Catholic Hospice, we encourage people to interview a hospice agency. Don't just take whoever your physician tells you to, or your social worker in the hospital. You really need to be educated. We, even when we meet somebody who says they want our services, we give them the opportunity to interview other programs. They need to know what to ask and what to expect. Things like, is the hospice not-for-profit or for-profit? Is there a mission statement or a business statement? Is it part of a national chain, part of a healthcare system? Is it a standalone? Have they ever been caught committing insurance fraud? I mean, these are things that families can just simply Google to be educated about. In detail, we tell families, get in writing what type of services will be offered to you, so if that doesn't happen, you have some recourse later. The reason we tell people to interview is that these hospices appear to be very godly programs. Mother Teresa is a hospice a county away from where we are. You can see the cross in the letter T. If you go on their website, you'll find no mention of God or godly principles, nothing about the Declaration on Euthanasia. In fact, Teresa is the owner's mother. And you could see how deceptive this is. And if you're in a crisis in the hospital and you just don't know what to do and someone recommends it, you look at the logo and you think, well, that must be okay. That particular program is one that supports terminal sedation. Divine Hospice Care is a national organization, same thing. They've got the dove and the little olive branch and all that, but you get on their website, there's nothing about God. It is a for-profit run by shareholders. We know in caring for folks over the years that faith really does matter when making end-of-life choices. When you land in the ER, that's one of the first questions they ask you as you're being triaged. What's your faith? Do you have a faith preference? But when you bring someone home to die, nobody bothers to ask. And so we've really been pushing some education with the physicians around the area I'm in, trying to encourage them to ask these questions. I think it's fair, but many of them are pushing the hospice that's owned by that hospital system or whatever. So the question doesn't get asked at all. That's okay. So as we've talked about, this commitment to embrace life as it applies to the terminally ill shows us that we have clearly lost our direction. So as we did when protecting the unborn, we desperately need to demand that care of the dying uphold the pro-life teachings of the Church, and as Pope John Paul II commanded, are not preyed upon, neglected, or offended at the sacred time of life. We know that many present-day hospices contrast starkly with this affirmation of life, and we can no longer ignore that all hospices are not pro-life. The majority of hospices today are for-profit or for-profit minded in how they operate. We cannot ignore hospice fraud is soaring. Hospice is not a safe alternative to protect against the euthanasia movement. You need to look deeper and educate yourselves before you sign on to anything or encourage a family member to. We need to remain educated ourselves on the present-day end-of-life issues. So just as we did with the pregnancy centers, we now know that all hospices are not created equal. The realization that many of these hospices that once were considered the most humane of healthcare institutions are putting profit ahead of mission, committing neglectful practices, and committing stealth euthanasia should provoke re-examination of our own faith and initiate a search for pro-life hospice alternatives. Recapturing sanctity and reverence requires deep investigation of what's going on in the present day. We need to be better educated. We need to get engaged in the cause, and apply it to upholding our own Christian responsibilities. Our vision at Catholic Hospice is to encourage Christians, especially our Christian leaders, to recover a vision for our historic responsibility to renew and restore pro-life care for the dying. We want to re-educate Christians and Christian leaders to redeem entire cultures, not just individuals, by upholding the Church's pro-life teachings at end of life. And as we did with the unborn, we must explore how the gospel can be upheld at end of life by mobilizing Christians not only to speak out, but to act. Act by getting involved in learning the education, gaining legal advice, getting consultation, not only when facing end-of-life issues, but before. If we're armed before, when we're faced with these issues, when we're faced with having to make this decision for a loved one, we'll make a better decision if we're educated. We need to attempt to curb deceptive advertising and marketing that target the vulnerable facing unfortunate terminal illness. And ultimately, we need to act by developing a nationwide pro-life hospice network, just as we did with the unborn. We need to focus on establishing centers in every state to promote pro-life care of the dying. These centers or organizations could then collaborate on educational and other initiatives to provide the most caring and helpful encouragement possible for those dealing with end-of-life issues. This would include bereavement and healing ministries. So just as you know the location of your pro-life pregnancy centers, we encourage you to help us form this network so that we all know the location of pro-life, end-of-life resource centers. Dear Heavenly Father, as we offer ourselves to do your will, we desire our hands to touch in gentleness, our eyes to see with love, our hearts to beat with compassion, and our lips to speak peace and comfort to those who are entrusted to our care. And whether great or small, help us to be obedient to you and work to be the change needed in this world. Help us to minister one person at a time to those who are on their final journey home to you. Thank you.